So I'm here with Stephanie Smith of the Vancouver Greens.
Hi.
Hi, Stephanie. Can you tell us a bit about yourself?
Sure. I am a community legal advocate and union activist. I started training at the Downtown Eastside Residents Association in the late 1990s. I have worked at a number of nonprofits, including Mosaic, for the mental health law program at CLASS. I've case managed at DTES Vancouver, and most recently I worked at First United on the legal advocacy team there, and I'm now a union rep with UFCW 1518.
So you live in the Downtown Eastside and
Yes.
you're a tenants advocate?
Yes.
So you probably know a thing or two about the housing crisis, don't you?
Yeah. I've been working with tenants for a long time, and those of us who have been doing that work or working with other sort of low-income or at-risk residents of Vancouver have seen this crisis develop, and it's been really frustrating because we've been trying to get government to take steps to prevent it from developing, and governments have not done what they needed to do. So, a lot of the more recent, really explosive examples of the crisis, the explosion of people like living in tents on the streets, it appears quite sudden and recent, but it's not. You can track its genesis back to the 1990s, when the federal government withdrew funding for non-market housing. You can look back to government's failure to make amendments to the Residential Tenancy Act that would have protected SRO tenants from unreasonable rent increases and kept that housing affordable. You can look at the failure of governments to increase income and disability assistance rates. Like, there are so many obvious things that have happened, and so many obvious and simple things that we could have done to prevent this crisis, and yet we have not.
So you said that the steps that needed to be taken have not been taken.
Yes.
What steps would you take if you were to be elected on October 15th?
Right. And it's so frustrating because it would have been much simpler to prevent this crisis from happening than it is to remedy it. Now that so many people are homeless or at risk, and so many people have become unwell and had their health deteriorate as a consequence, and more broadly, stepping away from the people who are living out in the streets, but the city as a whole. So many people have been left, what's the word I'm looking for, in real distress and fear. Because they are, at risk of rent eviction or dem eviction, and they know that if that were to happen to them, they'd be priced out of the city forever. Right? That sense of fear, that malaise, I think, has really negatively affected our civic life, and it is going to be very hard for us to bring people out of that insecurity and into the belief that they have a future in the city. At the city level, there are things that we can do, and some of them are things that were traditionally the responsibility of other levels of government, but other levels of government have not done what we needed them to do, so now we must act. Previously, tenant protections were primarily the function of the provincial government, but municipalities have found creative ways to sort of create stopgaps, right? To plug the holes that the provincial government has left where tenants are unprotected. So we can bring vacancy control to the city. I understand that there's a court challenge on that right now, but I am reasonably confident that we will be successful, and if we are not, then we can move to the side and tie vacancy control to specific civic actions like rezoning, for example, or development permits. But if we integrate rent stabilization into the Residential Tenancy Act provisions for additional rent increases when landlords do renovations. What we can do is create a regime where landlords are not able to raise the rent an unlimited amount in between tenants, but are still able to renovate their buildings. And if landlords don't have the ability to raise the rent an unlimited amount in between tenancies, that means that tenants won't be evicted for profit. It also will take a lot of the sting out of real estate investment trusts move into this market, because as we know, their business model is predicated on removing all of the tenants from a building and then jacking up the rents and then moving in new tenants. So that's the first thing that we would do.
So there are some candidates who consider themselves progressive, but they believe that the solution to the housing crisis is more market development.
Right.
What do you feel about that?
Well, there's a school of thought that we can fix the housing affordability crisis with a massive build out of market housing. I wish that were true, but I don't think it is. We have examples from other cities, I mean, closest to us, Seattle, where there has been a huge build out of market rental. And we found that there's an increase in the vacancy rate and to some extent a moderation of rents. The problem is that the devil's always in the details, and when you disaggregate the data, you discover that the benefits primarily accrue to higher income people in more expensive apartments. But people living in mid or lower price apartments do not experience the same benefits. So, and that's a problem generally with our housing policies and construction in Vancouver, where we build for and to the benefit of people at the higher income bands, and the people in the mid-range or the lower range don't realize any benefit. We don't build for them, and they don't get other benefits as a consequence. There's also an idea that housing chains will happen, that people will move out of less expensive apartments into more expensive apartments. Well, sure, sometimes that happens, but there are also a lot of things that can break that chain. And unless we moderate rent increases, stabilize rent increases in between tenancies, those chains immediately break as landlords raise the rent as much as they want to on those inexpensive apartments in between tenants, and they no longer are inexpensive apartments. So, it's an interesting idea, but I don't think it's the answer to our problems.
A major criticism of Vancouver's affordable housing programs has been that they are not affordable.
Yeah.
And I know that you're one of those critics.
Yes.
Can you expand upon that?
Right. And the housing that gets built with those programs is, often necessary housing. It's not just a Vancouver problem, it's also a provincial problem. There are a lot of affordable housing programs where qualifiers are, incomes of $80,000 to $120,000. There was one provincial program where the average income of the qualifying families was, I believe, like in the high 90,000s, right? And those folks need housing. But the median renter household income in Vancouver in the 2016 census year was $50,250 a year. We don't have the 2021 data yet, but I don't expect it to be hugely different, save the distortions from CERB, right? The median household income for a non-census family was $34,000 a year. So, those are the economic circumstances of renters in Vancouver. And if we are not building for those households, then we are not serving our communities. And the people who live in those households are the workers who make this city work, a lot of them. So if we don't serve those households, if we don't serve the average renter, what ends up happening is that we create a city that is increasingly, for the wealthy or for higher waged white collar workers, and we drive most of our city's workers out of town entirely. That, I think, is not equitable. I want a city where everybody who lives here, everybody who works here, has a future.
So there's been a lot of debate at this election about public safety, and at least two of the parties are running on a campaign entirely centered on public safety in the Downtown Eastside.
Yes.
As a Downtown Eastside resident, what's your take on this matter?
There's no question that the Downtown Eastside is less safe than it was. It has always been unsafe for a lot of people. There are people in the Downtown Eastside, in my community, who have never been afforded the protection of the state, especially Indigenous women. They have always been unsafe. As the community has become more impoverished, people have had their housing become less safe, have become more homeless, have more people have become homeless. Predators in the community have gained more power, and that is something that we all feel. Sometimes I hear people say, "Oh, I feel safe in the Downtown Eastside," and they sort of use that idea to bludgeon people. Well, when I say that I have felt safe in the Downtown Eastside, what that means is that there are other people who are better victims than I am, because there is an expectation that if harm is done to me, I'll be afforded the protection of the state, right? All of that said, that's changed. Now, I no longer feel safe in parts of the Downtown Eastside. It's definitely become worse as people become more and more desperate. Where I think our community is poorly served is in the minimization of people's legitimate concerns for their safety in our community, particularly people in Chinatown. Chinatown feels abandoned. Chinatown has been the site of sort of disinvestment. Elders in the community are at risk of violence. The things that the community relies on are being lost to gentrification. That people's sense of place is evaporating. And when in the pandemic, when vaccination programs were being rolled out, there were no Chinese language materials. There's no access to critical health services in the pandemic. And I was at a meeting, a pandemic response meeting for people in the Downtown Eastside, and when a Vancouver Coastal Health representative was there, and I asked her, very nicely, what's the plan, what's the progress on Chinese language materials, she rolled her eyes. So, folks in Chinatown feel abandoned, and so, when people in Chinatown say that they don't feel safe, patting them on the head and telling them that crime numbers are down is dismissive and not productive is a very polite way to say it. People's experience of violence and lack of safety is real, and they are entitled to be treated with respect. I feel that treating people with disrespect is helping to push people in the direction of pro-policing narratives, and pro-policing parties. I mean, of course, people in the community want more community policing. Of course they do. It's not surprising. They feel unsafe. Insulting them for that doesn't get us anywhere. Working on actual community safety solutions while acknowledging their lack of safety is the way to get us there.
So what steps would you take to make Downtown Eastside residents feel safe?
I think that one thing that's really useful to know is that something that we do that makes one group of people safer and more secure will ultimately contribute to everyone else's safety and security. Everybody's safety and security is bound up together. There are steps that we can take in Chinatown specifically to ensure that the environment is safer for people, we can bring in accompaniment for elders. We can increase community and non-police patrols. We can ensure that people who are patrolling never patrol alone, because of course that poor security guard who was attacked was patrolling alone, and should always be accompanied. We should ensure that we take vacant storefronts and fill them. There's a bunch of city real estate there that we can ensure is occupied. We can move community programming and arts programming into it, so that sense that the street is abandoned, or the area is abandoned, diminishes. We can also clean up graffiti. We can improve lighting. We can support community programs for elders and youth. So these are all things that we can do right now. We can also get people who are living in tents in the community stabilized. And I did not support the idea of tiny homes a long time ago, or even a few years ago. I believed that the province would bring the supportive and modular housing that we need online, but it hasn't. And it takes 6 months to get modular housing online. Folks don't have 6 months. A couple of years ago, Councillor Fry brought a motion for a tiny homes pilot project. It passed council, but it has stalled. The previous CEO of BC Housing said straight up that he would never fund a project like that. In my view, it's past time for the province to come and fund. And if they don't, then the city should consider funding tiny homes themselves. They are an improvement over tents. They are, self-contained. They have cots. They have doors that lock. There is city land that we can put them on. We can include warm washroom trailers and services. It's a place for people to get out of tents and get stable. And when the folks who need a place to live get into some place more stable, then the folks who are not homeless and who are, the folks who are exploiting homeless people in the community will then dissipate. It is unfortunately true that a lot of the homeless folks out on Hastings are also being preyed on, and there's a lot of violence happening because of that predation. And if we get people into stable housing, then that should also disperse the predators, and that will make all of the community safer. I appreciate that people want more policing in the community because folks aren't safe. The thing that concerns me is that we have no control over police operations. We have no control over how the police spends its budget. So, we can't even guarantee that the police would hire 100 new officers if we gave them a bunch of money. And even if they did hire those officers, or if they hired 1,000 officers, we would have no ability to compel them to police in the community the way that the community is asking for. That's why I think that we are, better. We spend our time and energy better working on the solutions that the city can control. There's one other thing that we can do. There's a crisis intervention model called CAHOOTS that was piloted in Eugene, I think in 1989. This is also something that Councillor Fry has been advocating for, where you have an emergency responder and a nurse who will attend people in crisis, but it's accessible through 911, so you don't have to create a parallel infrastructure for it, and it's accessible 24/7. So it's like police, fire, ambulance, CAHOOTS, and you can dispatch non-police crisis intervention services to people who are unwell. That reduces the need for policing. So I think that we should roll that out.
Why should renters like my family vote for Stephanie Smith and the Green Party?
A while ago when council was debating the Broadway plan, Councillor Carr asked city staff whether people were more likely to feel alienated if they were living in towers. And staff responded to her that the most important predictor of people's well-being was security of tenure. And I've thought about that a lot since that day. because security of tenure is at the heart of our housing policies. That's why it's so important to us to protect the housing that people have now, because too many people in Vancouver are looking over their shoulder, one rent eviction, one dem eviction, one new child, one layoff away from being forced from their homes and priced out of the city forever. We need to do something to ensure that folks get to stay where they are. And we also believe that we should have clarity and accountability in how we approach housing. Right now, we talk about housing in Vancouver, and we have definitions of different kinds of housing in Vancouver that, in my view, are misleading. For example, our definition of social housing, which is so broad that you could build the entire city out with it and get 0 units that are affordable to the median renter household. Right? We need to refocus and recalibrate our housing policy to the actual economic circumstances of real renter households, and we need to be clear about what we're doing. People know we're supposedly building a lot of affordable housing, but they're not seeing any affordable housing, and frankly that's why, because the question is always affordable for whom. So those two pieces of our housing policy, I think, is why folks should vote for us. I also think that it's really important to build rental housing, but a lot of people don't want to rent forever. The security of tenure is least achievable in rental housing. So we want to make that housing more secure, but we also want to build other kinds of housing where security of tenure is more part of the model. We want to build more co-op housing. I live in co-op housing, and it's been the difference between me being able to stay in the city, or having to leave the city. We also want to build affordable ownership housing. That is challenging, but it's really important to a lot of people in a lot of communities. If they're going to be spending that money, they want equity, right? They don't want to just sort of hand their incomes off to a landlord for the rest of their lives. They don't feel like that's the best thing for them and their families. And I think that that's a legitimate position, and we should build for those folks as well.
Affordable home ownership. Can you expand upon that a little bit?
Sure. So BC Housing actually has an affordable home ownership program that hasn't really gotten off the ground. It's something that's also supported in labor. We passed a resolution at the BC Federation of Labor Convention, I think in 2018, supporting the development of such a program. People want security of tenure, and people also want to have something to leave for their children, right? If they're putting their money into something, they don't just want to hand it off to someone else. And I think that that's something that we should respect, that provides a sense of security for folks. It's especially important for newcomers to Canada, building that equity, building that foundation and that future in the country for their families, and we should respect that and meet their needs as well. I also think that one of the reasons that rental housing isn't the solution, although it's an important part of our solution, is that I don't think that the public is well served if all we do when we're building new housing is consolidate more and more land into the hands of fewer and fewer property owners. I don't think that that's an equitable approach to solving the housing affordability crisis. I also think that's why co-ops are really important, because people at least have security of tenure. We can look at equity co-ops. We can look at at other models. The attacks on co-op housing have been really interesting to me. Co-ops are supposed to be mixed income communities. It has been, I think that there's been no better example of the attacks on the principle of universality in social benefits and social programs than the attacks on co-op housing. All of the folks who are living in False Creek South, many of whom have been there for a long time, being attacked as though they're doing something wrong because they're living in non-market housing and they're not completely impoverished. Like, that's not how the model's supposed to work. There's more than one way to build community. But when you put so many people into precarity and crisis, right? And when you don't build non-market housing for the people the market doesn't serve, then the people who do get access to non-market housing can be the focus of resentment. And for some people, there's a political value in stoking that resentment. I think it was not an accident that our previous Liberal government made sure that the only non-market housing it built was deep core social and supportive housing. They treated it like a boutique health product, because what that also does is gin up people's resentment when they see that a group of people that they understand to be sort of unworthy are the only people who are getting affordable housing built for them. Like, those kinds of civic divisions are a feature, not a bug, of sort of the right-wing neoliberal project. And that's something that we need to fight back against by ensuring that we have housing that's affordable and secure for all.
Can you remind us again of your number?
Yes, I know, and I'm so bad at this because every time I do an event, every time I do a debate, you're supposed to say your name and who you're running with at the beginning, and say your name and who you're running with again at the end. I am Stephanie Smith. I am running for City Council with the Vancouver Greens. I am 141 on the ballot, and I am running with incumbent councillors Adrian Carr, Mike Wiebe, and Pete Fry, and new potential councillor Devyani Singh.
Thank you very much for taking time of your busy day. I know that you're in the middle of a campaign and you have a week to go.
I know.
So thanks again for coming to talk to me.
Thank you so much for sitting down with me. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thanks.